My gift to you this Christmas is to read 12 episodes of Christmas stories, and this is the 11th. And I give to you To Springvale for Christmas by Zona Gale. Her children arise up and call her blessed. When President Arthur Tilton of Briarcliff College, who usually used a 2-cent stamp, said, "Get me Chicago, please," his secretary was impressed, looking for vast educational problems to be in the making, and heard instead, "Ed? Well, Ed, you and Rick and Grace and I are going out to Springvale for Christmas." "Yes." "Well, I've got a family, too, you recall. But Mother was 70 last fall, and do you realize that it's 11 years since we all spent Christmas with her? Grace has been every year. She's going this year, and so are we, and take her the best Christmas she ever had, too." "Ed, Mother was 70 last fall." At dinner, he asked his wife what should be a suitable gift, a very special gift for a woman of 70, and she said, "Oh, your mother. Well, dear, I should think that the material for a good wool dress would be right. I'll select it for you, if you like." He said that he would see, and he did not reopen the subject. In town on December 24th, he timed his arrival to allow him an hour in a shop. There he bought a silver-gray silk of a fineness and a lightness which pleased him, and at a price which made him uncomfortably guilty. And at the shop, Ed, who was Edward McKillop Tilton, head of a law firm, picked him up. "Where's your present?" Arthur demanded. Edward drew a case from his pocket and showed him a tiny gold wrist watch of decent manufacture and explained, "I expected you'll think I'm a fool, but you know that Mother was told time for 50 years by the kitchen clock, or else the shield of the black marble parlor angel who never goes. You get the idea, and so I bought her this." At the station was Grace, and the boy who bore her bag bore also a parcel of great dimensions. "Mother already has a feather bed," Arthur reminded her. "They won't let you take an automobile into the coach," warned her brother Edward. "It's a rug for the parlor," Grace told them. "You know, it is a parlor, one of the few left in Mississippi Valley, and Mother has had that ingrained down since before we left home." Grace's eyes were misted. Why would women always do that? This was no occasion for sentiment. This was a Merry Christmas. "Very nice, and Ricky'd better look sharp," said Edward dryly. Ricky never did look sharp. About trains he was conspicuously ignorant. He had no occupation. Some said that he wrote, but no one had ever seen anything that he had written. He lived in town, no one knew how, never accepting a cent from his brothers, and was beloved by everyone, most of all his mother. "Ricky won't bring anything, of course," they said. But when the train pulled out without him, observably a porter came straggling through the car, carrying 2 great suitcases, and following a perturbed man of 40-something who said, "Oh, here you are," as if it were they who were missing, and squeezed himself and his suitcases among brothers, sisters, and rug. "I had only a minute to spare," he said, regretfully. "If I had 2, I could have snatched some flowers. I flung 'em my card and told 'em to send 'em." "Why are you taking so many lugs?" they wanted to know. Ricky focused on the suitcase. "Just necessities," he said. "Just the presents. I didn't have room to get in anything else." "Presents, what?" "Well," said Ricky, "I'm taking books. I know Mother doesn't care much for books, but the bookstore's the only place I can get trusted." They turned over his books, fiction, travel, biography, a new illustrated edition of the Bible. They were willing to admire his selection, and Grace said confusedly but appreciatively, "You know, the parlor bookcase has never had a thing in it excepting a green curtain over it." and they were all borne forward, well pleased. Springvale had 800 inhabitants. As they drove through the principal street at 6 o'clock on the evening of December 24th, all that they expected to see aboard was the popcorn wagon and a cat or two. Instead, they counted 7 automobiles and estimated 30 souls, and no one paid the slightest attention to them as strangers. Springvale was becoming a metropolitan. There was a new church on one corner, and a store building bore the sign Public Library. Even the little hotel had a rubber plant in the window and a strip of creotine overhead. The 3 men believed themselves to be a surprise, but mindful of the panic to be occasioned by 4 appetites precipitated into a Springvale menage, Grace had told. Therefore the parlor was lighted and heated. There was in the air the passage of odor of brown gravy, which no butler's pantry, ever having inhabited, seemed a permanent savory. By the happiest chance, Mrs. Tilton had not heard their arrival, nor the parlor angel, being in her customary eclipse, and the kitchen grandfather's clock wrong, had she begun to look for them. They slipped in, they followed Grace down the hall, they entered upon her in her gravy gingham apron, worn over her best blue serge, and they saw her first in profile, frosting a lemon pie. With some assistance from her, they all took her in their arms at once. "Are you surprised?" Edward said in amazement. "I haven't got over being surprised," she said placidly, "since I first heard you were coming." She gazed at them tenderly, with flour on her chin, and then said, "There's something you won't like. We're going to have Christmas dinner tonight." Their clamor that they would entirely like that did not change her look. "Our church couldn't pay the minister this winter," she said, "on account of the new church building. So the minister and his wife are boarding around with the congregation. Tomorrow's their day to come here for a week. That's a hard life, and I didn't have the heart to change 'em." Her family covered their regret as best they could and entered upon her little feast. At the head of the table, with her 4 children about her, the father's armchair left vacant, they perceived that she was not quite the figure they had been thinking her. In this interval, they had grown to think of her as a pathetic figure, not because their father had died, not because she insisted on Springvale as a residence, but because of her eyes. Just pathetic. Mothers of grown-up children, they might have given themselves the suggestion, were always pathetic. But here was mother, a definite person with poise and with ideas, who might be proud of her offsprings, but who, in her heart, never forgot that they were her offsprings, and that she was the parent stock. "I wouldn't eat 2 pieces of that pie," she said to President Tilton. "It's pretty rich." And he answered humbly, "Very well, mother." And she took with composure Ricky's light chant. "All the clothes they've got between them would hardly fill these up," said Mrs. Tilton mournfully. "Why on earth do you suppose they'd turn their back on a dinner that smells so good and go off into the country at noon on Christmas Day? They wouldn't do that for another invitation. Likely somebody's sick," she ended, her puzzled look denying her tone of finality. "Well, thank the Lord for the call to the country," said Ricky shamelessly. "It saved our day." They had their Christmas dinner. They had their afternoon safe and happy, uninterrupted. 5 commonplace-looking folk in a commonplace-looking house. But the eye of the love knew that this was not all. In the wide sea of their routine, they had found and taken for their own this island day unforgettable. "I thought it was going to be a happy day," said Ricky at its close. "But it hasn't. It's been heavenly. Mother, shall we give them the rest of their presents now? You and I?" Not yet, she told them. Ricky, I want to whisper to you. She looked so guilty that they all laughed at her. Ricky was laughing when he came back from that brief privacy. He was still laughing mysteriously. Then his mother turned from a telephone call. What do you think? She cried. That was the woman that brought me my turkey. She knew the minister and his wife were to be with me today. She wants to know why they've been eating a lunch in a cutter out that way. Do you suppose? They all looked at one another, doubtfully, then in the abrupt conviction. They went because they wanted us to have the day to ourselves. Arthur, said Mrs. Tilton with immense determination, let me whisper to you too. And from that moment's privacy he also returned smiling, but a bit rueful. Mother ought to be the president of a university, he said. Mother ought to be the head of a law firm, said Edward. Mother ought to write a book about herself, said Ricky. Mother's mother, said Grace, and that's enough. But you're all so mysterious, except me. Grace, said Mrs. Tilton, you remind me that I want to whisper to you. Their train left in the late afternoon. Through the white streets they walked to the station, the somber little woman, the buoyant, capable daughter, and the three big sons. She drew them to seclusion down by the baggage room and gave them 4 envelopes. Here's the rest of my Christmas for you, she said. I'd rather you'd open it on the train. Now, Ricky, what's yours? She was firm to their protests, and the train was whistling when Ricky owned up that the rest of the Christmas present for his mother was a brand-new daughter to be acquired as soon as his new book was off the press. We're going to marry on the advance royalty, he said importantly, and live on. The rest was lost in the roar of the express. Edward, shouted Mrs. Tilton, come here, I want to whisper. She was obliged to shout it, whatever it was, but Edward heard and nodded and kissed her. There was time for her to slip something in Ricky's pocket, and for the other good-byes, and then the train drew out. From the other platform they saw her brave, calm face against the background of the little town. A mother of grown children, pathetic? She seemed to them at that moment the one supremely triumphant figure in life. They opened their envelope soberly and sat soberly over the contents. The note scribbled to Grace explained. Mother wanted to divide up now what she had had for them in her will. She would keep one house and live on the rent from the other one, and here's all the rest. They laughed at her postscript. Don't argue. I ought to give the most. I'm the mother. And look at her, said Edward solemnly. As soon as she heard about Ricky there at the station, she whispered to me that she wanted to send Ricky's sweetheart the watch I'd just given her, and took it off her wrist then and there. That must be what she slipped in my pocket, said Ricky. It was. She asked me, he said, if I minded if she gave those books to the new Springvale Public Library. She asked me, said Grace, if I cared if she gave the new rug to the new church that can't pay its minister. President Arthur Tilton shouted with laughter. When we heard where the minister and his wife ate their Christmas dinner, he said, she whispered to me and asked me whether she might give the silk dress to her when they get back tonight. All this they knew by the time the train reached the crossing where they could look back in Springvale. On the slope of the hill lay the little cemetery, and Ricky said, and she told me that if my flowers got there before dark, she'd take them up to the cemetery for Christmas for Father. By night she won't have even a flower left to tell her we've been there. Not even the second side of the turkey, said Grace, and yet I think, so do I, her brother said. The end. That was short but sweet. Very cool story. And that was the 11th episode. Stay tuned tomorrow for the last Christmas episode.